Hello everyone, my name is Rennie Ching and I am a Senior Research Fellow at the Program in Global Surgery and Social Change at Harvard Medical School. Today I will be talking about part 2 of the lecture series on how to write a peer-reviewed paper. Our learning objectives today are: first, to talk about the submission process; second, to learn about the peer review process; and third, to review any ethical issues associated with publication. In today's session, we will cover the submission process, how to write a cover letter, the peer review process, what happens after submitting papers, revisions and how to respond to reviewers, how to handle rejections, authorship issues, and the ICJME authorship criteria. We are going to start by talking about the submission process. As mentioned before in part 1 of this lecture series, ideally, you should pick the journal that you would like to submit to before you even start writing the manuscript. When you are submitting your journal, closely follow the authorship instruction of the journal. Check what requirements there are in terms of length, format, spacing of the lines, and also in terms of the number and the style of references. You can only submit to one journal at a time, so pick very carefully which journal you would like to aim to first. Traditionally, when authors submit articles for publication, they do not need to pay a publication fee associated with it. And this is because the fee of publication is borne by the readers when they pay to read articles. Open access journals have arisen as an alternative to traditional journals, as this makes journal articles much more accessible to the readers. Readers can read open access journals for free. However, as a result, the fee of publication has to be borne by the authors when they submit their manuscripts. Check the requirements of the open access journals, as some journals may waive or discount the publication fee for authors from low and middle income countries. And some examples of these journals are PLOS and BMC journals. These kind of journals can help to achieve greater equity in both publication and access for research for researchers and readers from low and middle income countries. Most journals require a cover letter to go along with the manuscript, and this is usually 1 page long. And again, please check the specific instruction for your journal, as this may be different for each journal. We will go through a template for a cover letter to help you with the cover letter writing process. The first paragraph of the cover letter can contain the title of the paper, the article type, for example, original research, review, research letter, or correspondence, and the journal name. And a written example is listed below. On behalf of my co-authors, I am pleased to submit the manuscript entitled Insert Title for consideration as Insert Article Type in Insert Journal Name. The second paragraph of the cover letter can cover why this issue is important, and it can also cite related papers in the journal for some extra points in terms of gaining the editor's attention. So this part will be an abbreviated version of the introduction section of your manuscript. In the third paragraph, you can talk about what you did and what you found, and essentially, you summarize the study methods, design, and population, and you state your message here. So remember how we talked about how you should have one message as the key finding of your manuscript, and you should weave this throughout the cover letter and throughout the manuscript. So this is the place in the cover letter where you should also weave in this message. The last paragraph should really make a case on why the paper deserves to be published in this journal, and it finishes the cover letter on a strong note. So in this paragraph, you can talk about novelty, any impact or any importance of the paper. For example, is it the first paper from the region? Is it the first paper on this topic from Haiti? Does the paper use a novel method? Are there important policy implications? Is the paper studying an important public health issue? So these are all things to think about that can help to make your cover letter end on a strong note and convince the editor that this paper deserves to be published. In summary, this is the cover letter template that we've talked about. And the last thing is just to check if there's anything else on the journal's instruction as to what you should include in the cover letter. Some journals require you to declare any conflict of interest in your cover letter as well, so it's always worth checking the journal's requirement. Next, we will talk about the peer review process. And this is what happens after you submit your journal and before you receive a reply from the editor of the journal. This diagram summarizes the peer review process, and I would encourage you to save this image and take a closer look. And we will go through each of the steps in the peer review process in the next few slides. Peer review is review of your research work by other researchers in your field. And in most cases, the editor of the journal and the peer reviewers that they select are other researchers in your field who are qualified to judge the merit of your work. So what happens after you submit an article? Firstly, the manuscript will be screened by the editor. If the editor does not think the manuscript is worthy of consideration, and if they think that the manuscript is not a good fit for their journal, the manuscript may be returned to the author very quickly with rejection from the editor. If the editor thinks that the manuscript is worthy of further consideration, then they will select a panel of anywhere between 2 to 4 peer reviewers who might be familiar with this research topic. The peer reviewers will review the manuscript and send their comments to the editors. This may take anywhere between 2 weeks for some journals and a couple of months for other journals. The peer reviewers may sometimes request an independent statistical review to check the statistical analysis performed in the manuscript. Once the editor receives all comments from reviewers, they will review these comments along with the manuscript and make a decision. This decision can be to accept, to request revisions, or to reject the manuscript. This decision will be returned to the authors along with the comments from the peer reviewers. If the authors are invited to make revisions, then they would have the opportunity to respond to the editors, and then the editor would make a final decision. However, if the paper is rejected outright, then the authors may need to look for another journal to submit to. So now we will talk more about the 3 outcomes following a peer review process. The first outcome, as we mentioned, is immediate acceptance. And this is very, very rare nowadays. Invitation to revise is a much more common outcome. And sometimes the editors will indicate that they will provisionally accept the article if these revisions are made. Normally, when authors are invited to make revisions, there is a reasonable chance that the manuscript will be accepted after responding to the comments. However, there is no guarantee. The third outcome is that the paper may be rejected outright after peer review process. In this case, unfortunately, the authors cannot resubmit the manuscript to the same journal. However, they can take the feedback from the peer reviewers, improve the article, and submit to a different journal. When the editor returns your manuscript along with comments from reviewers, comments normally fall under 2 categories. major comments, or minor comments. It is not uncommon that reviewers may make a comment and you might not agree with it completely, or it might not be feasible to take into the suggestion of the reviewers. A really tricky thing would be to how to respond to reviewers politely, whilst bearing in mind the limitations of how much feedback you can incorporate into your manuscript. Minor points are normally small mistakes in terms of spelling, grammar, or in terms of the labeling on the tables and figures. It is normally a good idea to concede all minor points, even if you don't agree with the reviewers. For major points, answer them point by point. And even if you don't agree with the reviewers, try not to directly refuse to incorporate their feedback. If you're asked to do something that you cannot do, then you can add this to the limitation section of the manuscript. Always try to show the reviewers that you are actively taking their feedback into account and you are trying to do something about it within your manuscript. When you respond to comments from peer reviewers, there are normally two products that you're required to produce in your reply to the editors. The first one would be a response letter, and the second one would be a revision of your manuscript. The response letter should be polite, contrite, and civil, and it should be grateful for the feedback and comments from the reviewers. The response letter should include a short introduction, and in the response letter, you can copy and paste each individual comment from each reviewers and then follow this up with a response directly after each comment. The response letter will be accompanied by a revision of the manuscript, and usually the editor would ask for track changes so they can see what changes you have made and how the feedback from the reviewers have been incorporated into your manuscript. This is an example of what a response letter might look like. So you start the response letter with an introduction, saying that you are very grateful for the thoughtful review of the manuscript by the reviewers, and you have considered their suggestions carefully and you have done your best to address them. And with these revisions, you feel that the manuscript has been substantially improved. This generic introduction can be altered however you see fit for your manuscript. However, the general tone should be positive, polite, and contrite. This introduction can be followed by point-by-point response to each of the comments. This is an example of what a point-by-point response might look like. For example, the comment from the reviewers is that the authors barely mentioned HIV status, which was not significantly associated with recent transmission, and this finding is somewhat counterintuitive. The response from the authors is to add an additional paragraph into the discussion section of the manuscript, incorporating this comment from the reviewers. So this is an example in which the authors will add something to their manuscript in response to a very good comment and very good feedback from the reviewers. However, there may be other instances that would be more difficult to incorporate comments from reviewers. It might be a case where you are unable to implement the suggestion of the reviewers. For example, here, the reviewers commented that the authors never mentioned the effects of the strain that were prevalent in the transmitted cases, and the reviewer has asked the authors to please comment on the possible effect of microbacteria strains on recent transmission. The authors replied, because strains are so closely associated with specific population groups, and because our routine surveillance data does not allow us to control for patient characteristics that define these populations, we were unable to assess the effect of strain within this analysis. However, we agree that this is an important question to address and should be pursued in further analysis. We have added the following acknowledgement of this limitation to our manuscript. Here, what we can see about the reply from the authors is that whilst the comment from the reviewer is not possible to implement, the authors acknowledge that they agree with the reviewers, they acknowledge the validity of the reviewer's comment, they have made efforts to include the reviewer's comment in the limitation section of their manuscript, and they have clearly outlined the reasons why it is not possible to incorporate the reviewer's comment into their study. Therefore, this reply is gracious, it's contrite, it's polite, and it is also positive. And these are all criteria which can guide a good response to reviewers' comments. What happens if your manuscript is rejected by the editor? Luckily, you are not alone here. Millions of people have been in a similar situation in the past. Rejection is common, and a part of being a researcher is learning how to handle rejections. If you need some time to process the rejection and to come to terms with it, you can put the paper away for a couple of weeks to give yourself some headspace. You can refine the manuscript with the reviewer's comments, and you should definitely consider submitting to another journal. When you entered your abstract into Jane, which we talked about in part 1 of this lecture series, there's a list of similar journals that Jane would have generated. So you can work down your list and just pick another journal. Sometimes different journals may have different guidelines regarding formatting, and this often requires touching up the manuscript a little bit to make sure that it's in line with the guideline of the new journal that you're aiming to submit to. It is not uncommon that sometimes a manuscript is submitted to more than 5 journals before it finally finds a journal that accepts it for publication. Therefore, don't be disheartened and don't lose hope in this process, and always keep trying to submit the manuscript to more journals. And the opportunity to have feedback from reviewers is really valuable, and make sure you make full use of it in terms of improving your manuscript as much as possible with each submission. Lastly, we will talk about the ethical issues around publication. Authorship can be contentious sometimes, and issues around authorship may include omission, too few authors, inclusion, too many authors, and not all authors may have made substantive input into the manuscript, and they may be honorary authors. The order of authorship may also be another contentious issue. Too much importance may have been placed on some authors, and other authors may be left too far down the authorship list. So why is authorship important? Firstly, authorship recognizes the contribution that a researcher has made in the research project. Secondly, authorship promotes accountability of the research data. If someone's name is associated with the paper and the data, then they have a degree of responsibility to it, and this can help to prevent fabrication, fraud, or plagiarism of results. And thirdly, authorship can be important for career progression, promotion, or grants, and therefore it's important that all researchers who have made a substantial contribution to the research project should be recognized as authors. According to the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, authors must fulfill 4 criteria, and this is the gold standard authorship criteria used in research. Firstly, authors must have made substantial contribution to the conception or design of the work, to the acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of data. Secondly, The authors must have drafted the manuscript or revised it critically for important intellectual content. Thirdly, authors must have approved the final version to be published. And fourthly, they must have agreed to be accountable for all aspects of the work. Different journals may also have different requirements for authorship. Usually, journals allow a maximum of 6 to 8 authors, and some journals may require a contribution statement of the input that each author has made into the study. For example, in this contribution statement, the authors have explained that HEJ and CMY and MCB have designed the study, and these other authors have extracted the data. This author has analyzed the data, and these authors were involved in writing the first draft. The process of detailing author contribution can also help the corresponding author of the paper to decide which authors should not be acknowledged as authors and should only be contributors, as sometimes when writing this contribution statement, it becomes apparent that some authors who were thought should be authors initially have not made enough contribution to the manuscript to qualify authorship. What should the order of authorship be? Generally, the more towards the front, the better. However, an important exception is with the last author. Normally, the last author or the senior author is a very prestigious position, and this is usually the senior supervisor and the principal investigator of the study. Recently, the second to last position has also been receiving increasing recognition as a co-senior author, and this is increasingly used by studies that have been collaboration between multiple research institutions. The first author is the lead author, and this should be normally a junior researcher who has been leading the study and who has put most effort into it. Increasingly, there can also be co-first authors if there is collaborative research between high and low middle-income country institutions, and if multiple people have put a lot of effort into the study. The prestige then drops off from second author to third author, and so on. Normally, the second author would also have made substantial input into the study, and the level of input and level of prestige both decreases as we go from first onwards, and then it suddenly increases again with the last author. What are some alternatives to traditional authorship? If someone has made input into the study, but their contribution does not meet the authorship criteria, then they can be acknowledged as contributors in the acknowledgement section at the end of the paper. Increasingly, there has been group authorship has arisen as an alternative to individual authorship, and this can be a study group or a consortia made up of many researchers around the world who collaboratively collect data, work on the research, and produce the publication. It is good to be explicit about authorship order and get agreement early on. This is so that each author has a clear expectation of what input they need to provide into the research study. And being explicit and having agreement on authorship can avoid conflict down the line, which not uncommonly happens in the manuscript writing process. Aside from authorship, plagiarism is also another issue. All information presented in the manuscript must be original, and if information from others' work have been used, then they must be cited, and they must be paraphrased as opposed to being direct word-by-word copies. Most journals use plagiarism detection software, so if you use others' work without citing them and without paraphrasing them, this will be detected in the submission process and the article will be rejected. Researchers have a professional obligation to uphold ethical standards in the publication process. If you recognize an error in your paper after it's already been published, do not just hide it, and instead contact the journal and publish a correction or an erratum. And you may have seen this section in some of the journals that you have read. If there has been substantial error in your paper, and if it's beyond the point of correction, then the paper should be retracted so that false results won't be out there to mislead other researchers. Most journals only allow results to be published in one journal, and most journals have a policy against overlapping or duplicate publications of the same results in different journals. There can be a publication bias across the entire research community, as most researchers may have a tendency to publish the data that are statistically significant or that are positive. However, sometimes it's just as important to publish negative results or results that lack statistical significance. Because if all researchers only publish statistically significant data, there could be a reporting bias from the entire research community, and this could lead to results that are not valid down the line. In summary, today we have talked about the submission process, the peer review process, and we've also talked about a number of ethical issues related to publication, such as authorship, plagiarism, and upholding truth in the publication process. I hope you have enjoyed this lecture series, and I wish you the best of luck in your manuscript writing and publication process.